a military leader, just drew a red line that could shatter West Africa. Ibrahim Traoré isn't asking for peace. He's demanding Benin choose a side or be destroyed. 3 nations, 1 army, 1 target. Foreign troops are being labeled enemies. Neighboring governments accused of treason. And the ultimatum is final: align with African sovereignty or face preemptive war. No diplomacy, no waiting, no second chances. This isn't a border dispute. It's the collapse of an entire regional order. And what happens in the next 72 hours could trigger the conflict no one saw coming. You need to hear what was actually said. The map of West Africa just changed, and most of the world didn't notice. Ibrahim Traoré, the military leader of Burkina Faso, has drawn a line across the Sahel that threatens to permanently fracture regional order. Speaking not just for his own country, but for Niger and Mali, Traoré declared that 3 nations once fragmented by coups and chaos now operate as a single strategic bloc. The message was unmistakable. Polite diplomacy is dead. Strategic ambiguity is over. The Sahel will no longer negotiate its sovereignty. This isn't rhetoric. It's a geopolitical recalibration born from years of warfare, failed partnerships, and what these governments view as Western abandonment. Traoré's statement marks the formal consolidation of the Alliance of Sahel States, a confederation that emerged after military juntas seized power in all 3 countries between 2020 and 2023. What began as isolated coups has evolved into a coordinated bloc that now shares intelligence, military operations, and increasingly foreign policy. The implication is clear. When one is threatened, all 3 respond. The timing matters. For over a decade, France led counter-terrorism efforts across the Sahel through Operation Barkhane, deploying thousands of troops to combat jihadist insurgencies linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But public sentiment turned. Protests erupted in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey, accusing France of prolonging instability to maintain influence. One by one, the juntas expelled French forces. Mali ordered them out in 2022. Burkina Faso followed in 2023. Niger, after its own coup, did the same. The vacuum left behind wasn't filled by the West. It was filled by Russia. Russian mercenaries, particularly the Wagner Group and its successors under the Africa Corps, have embedded themselves across the region. They provide training, equipment, and tactical support. But more importantly, they offer something the West would not: unconditional backing without lectures on democracy or human rights. For Traoré and his counterparts, this partnership represents autonomy. For their critics, it represents a dangerous alignment with an authoritarian power that prioritizes extractive deals over stabilization. Traoré's declaration that survival has replaced courtesy as the guiding principle reflects a deeper shift in how these governments view their place in the international system. They no longer seek approval from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. They view ECOWAS, the regional bloc that once mediated West African crises, as compromised and toothless. When ECOWAS threatened military intervention after Niger's coup, the Alliance of Sahel States warned that any attack on one would be treated as an attack on all. ECOWAS backed down. This is where the stakes become clear. The Sahel is not just another region experiencing instability. It sits at the crossroads of the Maghreb, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Atlantic coast. It controls critical migration routes into Europe. It holds vast reserves of gold, uranium, and other resources that global powers depend on. And it remains the epicenter of one of the world's fastest-growing jihadist insurgencies. If this alliance holds, it could reshape security architecture across West Africa. If it fractures, the collapse could be catastrophic. But unity born from crisis is fragile. These 3 nations share grievances, but their internal challenges are immense. Burkina Faso faces one of the world's worst displacement crises, with over 2 million people fleeing jihadist violence. Mali's north remains outside government control. Niger, despite its strategic importance, is economically fragile and dependent on foreign aid that has now been suspended. The question isn't whether they can survive together. It's whether they can govern effectively while maintaining this posture of defiance. What happens next could redefine the region. If the Alliance of Sahel States consolidates power and delivers security gains, it could inspire other African nations to reject traditional partnerships in favor of non-Western alternatives. If it fails, the resulting instability could destabilize the entire Sahel and accelerate the humanitarian catastrophe already unfolding. Traore has made his position clear. The age of deference is over. Whether that leads to sovereignty or chaos depends on what comes next. And the world is watching, even if it doesn't fully understand what it's witnessing yet. Burkina Faso's military leader just accused a neighboring government of enabling covert warfare. Ibrahim Traoré, speaking for the Alliance of Sahel States, has publicly named Benin as a security threat, alleging that President Patrice Talon's administration is allowing foreign military actors, logistics networks, and potentially hostile armed groups to operate within or pass through its territory. This isn't a diplomatic complaint. It's an accusation of complicity, and it signals that the Sahel's new military alliance is willing to confront not just insurgents, but the governments it believes are harboring them. The geography here is critical. Benin shares a 306-kilometer border with Burkina Faso and sits directly south of Niger. For years, it has maintained relatively stable relations with Western powers, hosting French military assets and cooperating with U.S. security initiatives in the Gulf of Guinea. But what Cotonou views as pragmatic partnership, Ouagadougou now frames as a threat. Traoré's argument is direct. Any country that allows foreign forces hostile to the Sahel to use its soil, airspace, or ports is not neutral. It is complicit. This accusation doesn't exist in a vacuum. Since 2022, Benin has emerged as a logistical hub for Western military operations in West Africa, particularly as France and the United States were expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. With bases shuttered in the Sahel, Benin became an alternative. French advisors, intelligence assets, and contractors have maintained presence there. American drone operations and training missions have continued. For Western powers, Benin offers access without the political volatility of the coup belt. For Traoré, that access is a dagger pointed at his border. The term dangerous ambiguities is deliberate. Traoré is rejecting the idea that Benin can claim neutrality while hosting foreign militaries that his government views as adversaries. In his framing, there is no middle ground. Either a state supports Sahel sovereignty, or it enables foreign interference. This binary worldview reflects a broader shift in how the Alliance of Sahel States defines security threats. It's no longer just about jihadist groups. It's about any actor, state or non-state, that could destabilize the bloc or undermine its autonomy. This is where the stakes become clear. If Traoré's accusations are more than rhetoric, if Burkina Faso genuinely believes Benin is facilitating hostile operations, then the risk of interstate conflict becomes real. Cross-border tensions in West Africa have historically been managed through ECOWAS mediation, but the Alliance of Sahel States has effectively withdrawn from that system. There is no neutral arbiter left. And with Russian advisors embedded in Ouagadougou and Niamey, the potential for miscalculation or proxy escalation is high. Benin, for its part, has denied involvement in destabilization efforts and maintains that its partnerships are defensive and focused on counterterrorism. President Talon has positioned his country as a stabilizing force in a volatile region, a bridge between the fractured Sahel and the coastal economies of West Africa. But perception matters more than intent in geopolitics. If the Sahel bloc views Benin as a platform for external interference, then Benin's denials are irrelevant. Trust has already collapsed. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the precedent it sets. If Burkina Faso can publicly accuse Benin of enabling foreign threats, what prevents Mali or Niger from doing the same to Togo, Ivory Coast, or Ghana? The entire southern tier of the Sahel could be reframed as hostile territory, not because of direct aggression, but because of their continued partnerships with Western militaries. This would turn West Africa's regional order into a series of competing blocs, with the Alliance of Sahel States on one side and ECOWAS-aligned coastal states on the other. The question now is whether Traoré's accusation is a warning or a prelude. Is this a calculated attempt to isolate Benin diplomatically, forcing it to reconsider its foreign partnerships? Or is it the groundwork for something more direct, a justification for intelligence operations, border closures, or even preemptive military action? The language suggests the latter is not off the table. When a military leader frames another government's policy as an active strategic threat, the implication is clear. Threats require responses. What happens next will reveal whether the Alliance of Sahel States is merely defensive or expansionist in its strategic posture. If Benin continues hosting foreign forces, does Ouagadougou escalate? And if it does, how far is it willing to go? The Sahel has rewritten its own rules. The question is whether it's prepared to enforce them beyond its borders. Ibrahim Traoré just authorized preemptive military action against a neighboring state. The leader of Burkina Faso has declared that any arms convoy, covert operation, intelligence activity, or hostile logistics linked to Benin will be treated as a direct act of aggression, and that the Alliance of Sahel States will respond immediately and collectively, without waiting for diplomatic clarification. This is not a threat, it's a doctrine. And it means that the threshold for interstate conflict in West Africa has just collapsed to the movement of a single convoy. The language is unambiguous. Traoré is not calling for dialogue or mediation. He is announcing that his government, along with Mali and Niger, has adopted a policy of preemptive response. In practical terms, this means that if intelligence suggests Benin is facilitating foreign military movements near the Sahel's borders, Burkina Faso reserves the right to strike first. The justification is framed as survival, not aggression, rooted in what Traoré describes as years of bloodshed and broken promises. From his perspective, the Sahel has already paid the price for waiting, for trusting, for believing that diplomacy could protect sovereignty. That calculation has now been reversed. This is a dramatic escalation in regional security posture. Historically, West African states have operated under norms established by ECOWAS, which prioritizes negotiation, mediation, and collective security frameworks. But the Alliance of Sahel States has explicitly rejected that system. By withdrawing from ECOWAS and establishing its own mutual defense pact, the bloc has created a parallel security architecture with its own rules. And those rules now include preemptive action based on perceived threats, not confirmed attacks. The margin for error has disappeared. The specific mention of arms convoys and covert operations is significant. It suggests that Burkina Faso believes such activities are already occurring or are imminent. Whether that belief is based on verified intelligence or strategic suspicion is unclear, but the policy has been set regardless. If a logistics vehicle crosses from Benin into Northern Territory, if foreign advisors are spotted near the border, if a drone flight path overlaps with contested areas, any of these could now trigger a military response. The question is no longer whether the Sahel Alliance will act, but how quickly and with what force. This is where the stakes become clear. Benin is not a failed state or a jihadist stronghold. It is a functioning democracy with economic ties across the region and security partnerships with France, the United States, and other Western powers. If Burkina Faso follows through on this red line, if it conducts strikes on Beninese territory or interdicts convoys it deems threatening, the consequences will ripple far beyond the two countries involved. Western governments will be forced to decide whether to support Benin diplomatically, militarily, or not at all. ECOWAS, already weakened by the Sahel's departure, will face a crisis it lacks the capacity to manage. And the risk of a broader regional war, one that pulls in multiple states and external actors, becomes real. The justification Traoré offers is telling. He frames preemptive action not as provocation, but as a lesson learned from years of conflict. The implication is that the Sahel has already been betrayed by allies, abandoned by partners, and forced to fight alone. In that context, waiting for confirmation or seeking diplomatic resolution is seen as weakness, a vulnerability that enemies will exploit. This mindset reflects a government that views itself as surrounded, under siege, and operating on borrowed time. It is the strategic logic of a state that believes it has nothing left to lose. But preemptive doctrines are inherently destabilizing. They shift the burden of proof. They assume hostility rather than requiring evidence of it. And they create situations where miscalculation, false intelligence, or deliberate provocation can trigger conflicts that neither side intended. If Burkina Faso acts on faulty information, or if an operation it perceives as hostile is actually benign, the result is the same: war. And once that threshold is crossed, de-escalation becomes nearly impossible. What happens next will determine whether this is a rhetorical red line or an operational one. If Benin continues hosting foreign military assets, does Ouagadougou strike? And if it does, how does Cotonou respond? The Sahel has declared that it will no longer wait for threats to materialize. The question is whether it can distinguish between real threats and imagined ones before it's too late. Ibrahim Traoré has given Benin an ultimatum: declare where you stand, or be treated as an enemy. In his closing remarks, the Burkina Faso leader framed the confrontation not as a bilateral dispute, but as a continental choice between sovereignty and subservience. He made clear that the Alliance of Sahel States is not seeking war, financial aid, or forced alliances, but it will no longer tolerate what it calls diplomatic illusions that mask foreign interference. Benin must openly align with African self-determination, or it will be judged complicit in undermining it. Patience, Traoré declared, has been rejected, and decisive action will follow. This is a demand for political clarity in a region where ambiguity has long been the default. For decades, West African states have navigated complex relationships with former colonial powers, balancing economic dependency, security partnerships, and rhetorical sovereignty. Most governments have avoided binary choices, maintaining ties with both Western allies and emerging powers like Russia and China. But Traoré is now forcing a reckoning. In his framework, there is no neutral ground. Either a state commits to what he defines as African sovereignty, or it enables foreign agendas. Silence is no longer an option, and silence in this context will be interpreted as hostility. The language is deliberate. Traoré insists the Sahel is not seeking war, but he has already outlined conditions under which military action would be justified. He insists the bloc is not demanding submission, but he has defined the terms under which Benin must prove its loyalty. This is a rhetorical strategy designed to shift blame for any future escalation onto Cotonou. If conflict erupts, Traoré wants the narrative to be clear. Benin had a choice, and it chose wrong. But what does choosing sovereignty actually mean in this context? For the Alliance of Sahel States, it means expelling Western military forces, rejecting ECOWAS oversight, and aligning with Russia as a primary security partner. It means adopting a foreign policy that prioritizes autonomy over integration, even if that autonomy comes at the cost of economic isolation and humanitarian crisis. For Benin, making that choice would require severing partnerships that have underpinned its stability and economic growth. It would mean antagonizing France and the United States, losing access to development funding, and aligning with a bloc that is internationally isolated and internally fragile. The cost of compliance may be higher than the cost of defiance. This is where the stakes become clear. Traoré is not just challenging Benin. He is challenging the entire model of post-colonial governance in West Africa. He is arguing that decades of partnership with former colonial powers have not delivered security, prosperity, or dignity, and that a fundamentally different approach is necessary. Whether that argument resonates beyond the Sahel will determine the future of regional order. If other African states begin to view the Alliance of Sahel States as a credible alternative to the Western-aligned status quo, the balance of power shifts permanently. If they view it as reckless and unsustainable, the bloc remains isolated. The rejection of patience is particularly significant. It suggests that Traoré and his counterparts believe time is not on their side, that waiting for diplomatic resolution or hoping for gradual change will only allow their enemies to consolidate advantages. This is the mindset of a leadership that feels cornered, that sees external threats closing in and believes preemptive action is the only path to survival. It is also the mindset that leads to miscalculation, overreach, and conflicts that spiral beyond control. Benin now faces an impossible choice. If it publicly aligns with the Sahel's vision of sovereignty, it risks losing the partnerships that have kept it stable. If it maintains its current posture, it risks being labeled complicit and facing economic, diplomatic, or even military consequences. And if it tries to navigate a middle path, it will satisfy no one and remain vulnerable to pressure from all sides. What happens next will reveal whether Traoré's ultimatum is a negotiating tactic or a line that cannot be uncrossed. If Benin refuses to capitulate, does the Sahel follow through on its threats? And if it does, what does that mean for every other state in West Africa that has tried to maintain relationships with both African neighbors and Western powers? The demand for clarity is also a test, and the answer will determine whether this is an isolated crisis or the beginning of a continent-wide realignment.